Hello and welcome back to another video about the units of Company of Heroes 2. I'll tell you about the background of the units, and I'll inform you about what's historically accurate about them and what isn't. And today we're going to talk about the units of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the German army on the Western Front. So we start today with the cars, the trucks and the cars, and then we go through the half-tracks to the scout cars and the light tanks into the mediums and the heavies. So let's start with the big truck that you start with in the beginning. This is a unit with which you can build buildings. But in the war this was a real vehicle, and it was used to transport heavy stuff like guns, and it's called the SWS Halftrack. And SWS stands for Schwerer Wehrmachtsschlepper, and this is a vehicle that's just a big truck with tracks, so it's sturdier than normal trucks with only road wheels, and it was produced in the second half of the war. It was in service for the last 2 years of the war. Only 825 of these were built, which is not very much, but it's because of the weight and the material that had to be put in, and because of the development starting pretty late into the war. In the beginning these schleppers were truck-like half-tracks, but later it became a bit more like regular half-tracks, like the Sonderkraftfahrzeug 251, the Hanomag, the famous half-track of which you have seen the information in the Wehrmacht video. So this is a large truck, and it was supposed to pull stuff. The last building that you can make, the Schwerer Panzer headquarters, has a Flak gun on the roof, and that's actually realistic because there were two armed versions of the Schwerer Wehrmachtsschlepper, and one had the Flak 43 anti-aircraft gun, and the other one had a quadruple 20mm, the Flak Vierling. So this brings us to the next truck, which is over here, and it's an Opel Blitz cargo truck. And as you can see, this is the movable version. There are also static versions over here, and the Opel Blitz is a very normal truck. It was supposed to transport troops mostly, and ammo. So Opel Blitz produced this truck already before the war. It's called Blitz because Blitz means lightning, and the logo of the Opel factory is a lightning-like symbol, which you can see here in the front of the truck. So Opel Blitz is a regular truck, and after the war it continued to be used for, by companies that needed a transport truck. So actually this is a very plain and simple and straightforward vehicle, and so there's not really a lot to tell about it, except that this was the most used truck by the German army in the Second World War. Which brings us to the next car. The next car is the Cuba Wagon. The Cuba Wagon is what the Jeep was for the Americans, and the Cuba Wagon was for the Germans. Cuba Wagon is actually some kind of a Jeep, as you can see, and it was produced by Volkswagen. Volkswagen, of course, being famous for producing the Beetle, which was also the chassis of the Cuba Wagon was also used to put Beetle tops on it. And the Cuba Wagon was produced because the Wehrmacht needed a simple and useful Jeep-like car. So and this one that you can see here is it says in the description that it's a Cuba Wagon, but it's actually a Type 82 Cuba Wagon, because there are lots of variants in that have been in development, but the Type 82 is the most common one. It's called Cuba Wagon because the first versions of this car, they didn't have doors on the side like you can see here, and this one does, and because they didn't have doors, the soldiers or the occupants of the car, they needed to sit in bucket seats. So if they would sit on benches and the car would make a sharp turn, then they would fall out of the vehicle because of the lack of doors. So they produced the vehicle with bucket seats, and in German that means Kübelsitzwagen, and that meant that it was an abbreviation or a contraction, and it became Cuba Wagon. So Volkswagen produced this one, and it was actually designed by Ferdinand Porsche, and also some other factories produced this one, like Mercedes, Opel and Tatra. What made this vehicle pretty successful is the fact that it had a very flat chassis. So if it was in snow or deep mud, then the bottom would slide over the ground while the wheels were sinking in. So it didn't have a four-wheel drive, but because of this flat chassis, it was very competent at maneuvering its way over rough terrain. You can see here that the Cuba Wagon has a machine gun mounted on the in the back. It's an MG34, and actually that's not super realistic. It's not unrealistic, because there were Cuba Wagons with machine guns mounted on them, but there were many variants of the Cuba Wagon, and none of them had factory placed MG emplacements. So this was actually a field modification, which means that people were just bringing those mounts along with them and made them on the Cuba Wagon themselves. I only found one picture of a Cuba Wagon with an MG on it, and that's not even sure that was factory made. So that's why I think that they were only field modifications. The Allies actually captured a few of these, and they were testing it, and they concluded that it was on all in all aspects it was worse than what they had themselves, the Jeep. So they didn't want to imitate it or anything like that, and well, so the Cuba Wagon itself looks pretty realistic. The MG isn't, because from out of the almost 30 variants, there were none which had factory-made machine guns on them. Okay, so this brings us to the exception in this list. It's actually not really a vehicle, it's a tracked mine. This is the Goliath, and Goliath is of course a biblical character. It's a giant from the Philistine people, and he had to fight against David, and then lost. So that's pretty special that they still named it after him. The tracked mine was officially not called the Goliath. It was actually called the Leichter Ladungsträger Goliath, and the light charge carrier Goliath. And there were two variants of these. There were the electrically powered one and the petrol engine powered one. And the electrical powered one was supposed to drive to the enemy and being steered with large wires that were connected to the backside of the tracked mine, which made it dependent on the length of the cable and the presence of infantry to actually steer the vehicle. The petrol engined one didn't need any cables, which made it less vulnerable to enemy fire, because for example on the Normandy beach landings they were put into action, but they were not very successful because the electrical wires were all cut by preliminary artillery bombardments. So all those Goliaths were just sitting there, not being able to move because their source of power was gone. They were produced in between 1942 and 1944, and about 7,500 of these were built, and that's pretty many. That's actually a lot, but that's of course because you couldn't reuse them, and because after they exploded, they were just they were just gone. So both the electrical and the petrol engine one carried 60 to 100 kilograms of high explosives, and they were meant to blow up bridges, blow up fortifications, and they could also be used against tanks as long as they were stationary for a bit, because you could drive these little buggers into the trucks and then blow up the trucks, of course. The idea to make this was actually taken from a French design. When the Germans attacked France in 1940, they found that the French had been working on a thing like this, and they just took the drawings and fulfilled the development. That was actually the more of the other way around, from France to Germany, whereas we mostly saw that the Germans were taking stuff from the Soviets, and this one is actually taken from the French. So let's see what happens if it explodes. Large boom. And then it leaves a large plume of smoke and a little crater, of course. So, okay, let's move on to the scout cars.
Stand ready.
This is the Sonderkraftfahrzeug 221, and in the Wehrmacht video I've been talking about the 222. This is its predecessor. And actually this is a vehicle that was only used in the beginning of the war, because it was designed in 1934, and when the war actually broke out, then it turned out that it was an obsolete vehicle. It was too lightly armored, and there was not enough protection against enemy fire. The armament was too light. It actually has an MG42 mounted on this one, but the first versions didn't have those, of course, because the MG42 didn't exist by then. There were some alterations made, but to no avail. This vehicle just didn't make it, and this Leichter Panzer Wagon was only in use for a few years, and most of those were before the war. And the 222, its successor, was a lot more successful, and a lot more of those were built. The next Panzer Wagon is the Puma, and I already told you about it in the other video of the Wehrmacht. This is a schwerer Panzer Wagon because it has a lot more armament and a lot more armor. You can see that it has the sloped armor from the T-34 design, and it has the KWK 50mm gun. The KWK stands for Kampfwagenkanonen. And the Puma, which was its nickname, was used in the war in the later part, and 478 of these were built. So this was not a very common vehicle, it was pretty rare, but Oberkommando der Wehrmacht is specializing in super rare vehicles, as we will see. So let's go to the half-tracks, and we start with this one. This is the Sonderkraftfahrzeug 251/17. It's called the Flak half-track, and it's a version of the Sonderkraftfahrzeug 251. This is called the Schützenpanzerwagen 2 cm in German. It's an anti-aircraft vehicle, and it has the 2 cm Flak 38 mounted on a pedestal, which you can see here. It's actually on the pedestal. This is the same pedestal that you could use on the ground or on the back of other half-tracks like the Sonderkraftfahrzeug 7. But this one has the pedestal in the back of a 251, and there was this small armored turret to protect the gunners, especially from the sides. This is I guess this is from shrapnel from the ground or grenade explosions or something, because it doesn't look like it offers a lot of protection on the upper part of the vehicle. In the later part of the war, this vehicle was issued as a platoon commander's vehicle to replace the 251/10. The next half-track, this one, it's the 251/20, and it has an infrared searchlight. And this is called the Schützenpanzerwagen Infrarot-Scheinwerfer, which means armored car for riflemen, and mounted with a infrared searchlight. This one had the nickname Uhu because the Uhu, which is German for eagle owl, of course had the ability to spot things at night, and this one also had that ability. I'm going a bit further away because the turning of the light is making a lot of noise. I can't make it stop. So this infrared light was 60 centimeters in diameter. It had a range of 1.5 kilometers for illuminating targets at night. They guided infrared sight-equipped tanks, which in the latest part of the war there were these Panther tanks, and if you have seen the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht infantry video, you have seen the Sturmgewehr 44 with the Vampire equipment. This Vampire equipment for night vision was also installed on some tanks, and the tanks could work together with these infrared searchlights. So the 251/20, a version of the famous Hanomag vehicle.
Ready for action.
Okay, next half-track is this one. It's actually a regular 251, but it is a 251 which is mounted with Wurfrahmen 40. This is also a Schützenpanzerwagen, the Sonderkraftfahrzeug 251/1 number 2, because from the 251/1 there are different subversions, and this is one of them. This is the nickname was Stuka zu Fuß, or that means the Stuka on foot, and Stuka was the Sturzkampfflugzeug, which we can see here, and because the Stuka had these big sirens on the wings attached, and when they went into a dive to bomb a target, you would hear the typical howling noise of these horns on the wings of the Stuka. And this one also became known as the walking Stuka because of the noise that the rockets were making, and I guess it also had something to do with the devastating impact of the 28 centimeter rockets. The rockets made this weird sound, and therefore the other nickname is heulende Kuh, bellowing cow. And that's a bit weird because I'll demonstrate the sound for you, and then you will see that it's actually not really sounding like a cow. And I would advise that if it does sound like a cow to you, that you pick different beef next time when you're at the butcher's. These rockets, they were ripple fired, and therefore they were feasible to quickly saturate a target. And they were spin stabilized, but they were not very accurate, and therefore it was best to use several Stuka zu Fuß half-tracks together, because reloading took a lot of time because the rockets weighed had a large they were weighing heavily. On the front is an MG42 mounted for close anti-infantry support. Okay, let's have the Stuka fire for a bit.
Ready rockets. Creeping barrage. Fire. Task complete.
Actually, the sound of the firing is a bit disappointing. In reality, you would hear a bit like woo woo sound like that. A bit more like the Katyusha is sounding in game. And like I said, that doesn't really sound like a cow. So, this concludes the part about the half-tracks, and let's go to the light tank.
Ready for orders.
It's this one, the Lux Panzer II Ausführung L. And the Panzer II was a light tank developed in the stages before the war. It was the successor of the Panzer I. The Panzer I had only machine guns in the turret, and therefore they needed a tank which had something that could penetrate vehicles a bit more easily. So they came up with the Panzer II, which had a rapid-firing autocannon. That autocannon is still present on this version of the Panzer II, and this is the last version of the Panzer II that was ever made. And the Panzer II was actually quite obsolete in the last years of the war. because it wasn't able to take out enemy tanks anymore. In the beginning of the war, when the Germans were fighting against the Polish and the French, they were used to take out scout cars, half-tracks and trucks and other light vehicles like that. But later in the war, the presence of Allied armor was so big in most areas that they needed actually bigger tanks to counter all those. The Panzer II was actually only used for reconnaissance purposes. When the Panzer II version L was designed, it was also still before the war, but the prototype wasn't finished until 3 years later. So production started after the order for production was given in 1943. The Panzer II Ausführung L was attached to units that were called Panzeraufklärungsabteilungen, and that's actually what is recon is about. So Aufklärung is recon, and they were fast, and they could spot targets, for example for artillery, or they could inform their units of the presence of any enemy armor, for example. And there were not so many Luchses, only 104 were built, and production ceased in 1944 because they saw that they needed the material for more powerful vehicles than the Panzer II. Most of these were sent to the Western Front and fought in the Battle of the Bulge, so that's realistic. They were part of the 116th Panzer Division, which was fighting in both Hürtgenwald, Hürtgen Forest, and in the Battle of the Bulge. There were also some Panzer IIs on the Eastern Front, and they had some extra antennas and radio material. Lux means lynx, so again this one is named after a cat, but it's not a very big one, so therefore it's also not a very big cat. Okay, so we move on to the next vehicle with an autocannon, which is the Ostend. I already told you about the Ostend specifics in the Wehrmacht video, and actually there's not really much to add, except for the fact that the Ostend was also a not very common vehicle. It was pretty rare. Only 43 245 were built, which is even lower than the Panzer II that we were just talking about. So an extremely rare vehicle, and it was only there to provide some AA support for the armored columns of the Wehrmacht. If you want to know more about the Ostend, I suggest that you're checking out my other video about the vehicles of the Wehrmacht. Okay, the next vehicle is a vehicle which is not a tank but a tank destroyer, and it's the Yak Panzer 4/70V. And the Yak Panzer IV is called Yak Panzer IV because it was built on the chassis of the Panzer IV. The Germans already used some specialized vehicles in the destruction of enemy armor, and most of those were Stuks. And the Stuks were pretty successful, and especially because they had a low silhouette, and they were used in ambush roles. And after the Battle of Kursk, there were some reports that the Stuks were better at destroying enemy armor than the regular Panzers were. The idea was born to make Panzerjäger vehicles, and this one is one of the first that was actually developed. About 2,000 of these were built from the end of 1943 until the end of the war. Although this was a vehicle to destroy enemy armor, it was developed against the wishes of Heinz Guderian, who was the general inspector of the Panzertruppen, because he was in favor of producing more Panzer IVs. But because the report said that the Panzer IV was not so successful in destroying tanks, and instead they could better use Stuks, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht decided that the chassis of the Panzer IV that were still in production should be used to make Yak Panzer IVs. So the production of the Panzer IV was phased out. I'll talk about that in a bit, because we are going to talk about the Panzer IV in a few minutes. And then everything was focused on making tank hunter vehicles. So they wanted a big gun on a small vehicle. Which as a result makes a vehicle which doesn't have a turret, because if the gun is too heavy on a small vehicle with a turret, then the vehicle could not drive and use the gun at the same time, because it would topple over or flip over, and that would render the vehicle useless. The Panzer IV chassis that was used was the Ausführung H chassis, but it was replaced by sloped armor, so that you can see here. This one was sloped here, and it was also sloped on this part here. It had 80mm thick sloped armor, and therefore it had a lot of protection against enemy shells. And the Yak Panzer had a heavy gun, and because the frontal armor was heavy and the gun was heavy, and it made the Yak Panzer a bit less mobile and more difficult to operate in rough terrain. So the crews gave this the nickname Guderian Eente, Guderian's duck, and that was also a cynical nod to the fact that Guderian actually didn't want this vehicle. In December 1943 the prototype was finished, and then afterwards it started being produced in bigger numbers. This one is the 4/70V, and that's one of the two variants with the Pak 42 L70 gun, the heavy gun that I was talking about earlier. The V is the beginning letter of the designer, Vomag. There were also Panzer 470As, which were produced by Alket, which was the manufacturer of the Stuk 3. The Yak Panzer 470 was also known as the Yak Panzer 470V Lang, and Lang is German for long, because it was to be distinguished from its predecessor, which had a shorter L48 gun. So you could easily see which Yak Panzer you had in front of you. The Yak Panzer did fight in Normandy and in the Battle of the Bulge, and also some were sent to the Eastern Front. And because they had such a low profile, they were racking up several kills, and they performed poorly when they had to replace tanks. and because the losses were rising in the last few years of the war, they had to replace tanks and act as tanks sometimes, and there they, of course, they didn't excel. So let's move on to the next tank hunter vehicle, which is in-game actually an anti-infantry vehicle.
Standing by.
I'm talking about the Panzer 38 Hetzer. The Hetzer is actually the tank hunter vehicle I was talking about. The Hetzer was built on the chassis of a Panzer 38T. The 38T was actually a Czech tank, which was called the LT version 38. When the Germans took over Czechoslovakia after the Munich conference in 1938, they actually got that country for free. They didn't have to fight for it, so all the factories and all the production areas were 100% intact. So they just seized the factories and used everything in the factories for their advantage. And one of the things that they actually liked was that Czech tank version 38. So they used the chassis, the version 38 Czech tank was designed in 1938, and then over 100 were built, so not a lot, but the Germans used those tanks in campaigns against Poland and France in the opening stages of the war. When the war progressed, the tanks became obsolete because of their lacking firepower, so the chassis that they still had lying around were used to make an anti-tank vehicle, which was called the Hetzer. And the Hetzer was not a very common vehicle, let alone the Panzer Hetzer, and officially it was called the Panzer Wagon 38T mit Köbegerät. It says Kyobi here, which is a typo, and the Köbegerät was the flamethrower. You can upgrade this one with an MG34, and oh, I forgot to put instant production, but the tank crew can use a pintle-mounted MG34 for anti-aircraft duties. The Panzer was a really rare vehicle, and only 20 of these were built. So, like I said, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht is specializing in rare vehicles. Let's have it attack this point, so we can see how the flames are being put on the target, and actually it looks a bit wonky, but the flames are exiting the vehicle a bit like the Wasp, and for the Wasp that's pretty logical because it's usually aiming upwards, but when the barrel is low and the flames go up, it looks a bit weird. But let's not worry about that for too long. This is the Panzer Wagon 38 based on the Hetzer, which itself is based on the Czechoslovakian Panzer 38. So let's move on to the regular tanks, and the most regular tank of the regular tanks is the Panzer IV. This is the Panzer IV Ausführung J in German, I think, and the Ausführung J is the last Panzer IV that was ever built. Because when I was talking about the Yak Panzer IV, I already told you about the Panzer IV being taken out of production because its anti-tank duties were lacking. The J was actually a retrograde from the Ausführung H, because it had less armor, and they were also arriving in the later part of the war. So the Panzer IV factories couldn't use so much material anymore. So let's put instant production for a bit. Where was it again? Speed ups. All. That's it. Okay. So we can put the German. We can put the MG on it. It's a MG42, although most MGs on tanks were MG34s. And the J version of the Panzer IV was, like I said, it was a retrograde. The electric generator that was used for turret traverse was removed. So the crew had to rotate this turret manually again, which is quite some work, of course. And but they were being trained on it, and on a reasonably level ground, hand operation could traverse to 12.5 degrees in 4 seconds, which is pretty fast. And I don't think I could do that, especially not immediately. But they were modified and fitted with a second gear, which made hand operation easier, especially when the vehicle was on sloping terrain. So this J version had some spaced armor on the turret, like you can see here, and in game it also has skirts on the side. The Wehrmacht version only gets skirts if you gain some veterancy, but the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht Panzer IV has the skirts immediately. Those skirts were actually not very realistic in game, because they were in reality they were not normal Schürzen. They were called Thomas Schürzen, and they were wire mesh skirts. The wire mesh skirts, in German they are called Drahtgeflechtschürzen. They started to produce those in 1943, and when they were actually put on the vehicles, they were it was already almost the end of the war. The advantage was that the Schürzen were 50% lighter than normal Schürzen, and the crew could see through them, because Drahtgeflecht or the Thomas Schürzen, the wire mesh ones, they were like those spring bed bottoms. They you could see through those. The wires were intertwined but not closely knit together, if you know what I mean. So actually you could see through these skirts, and you can't in game, as you can see here, because these are solid skirts and not really see-through. So these Thomas Schürzen were named after a commander, which is called Wolfgang Domale, and he was in the staff of Guderian's headquarters in Berlin. So that's why they were called Thomas Schürzen. The Thomas Schürzen looked less effective than the normal Schürzen, but they were tested, and actually both types of skirts could stop the same anti-tank rifle bullet, but they were both not very good in stopping the real dangers from heavier projectiles being fired at the tank. So this Panzer IV is supposed to be a stronger one than the one for the Ostheer, but actually it's a bit of a weaker one, and skirts stand out as being really different from real life skirts in the Second World War. Okay, so let's move on to the successor of the Panzer IV, which is the Panzer V. And this is the Panther tank, and the Panther tank was also already present in the video of the Wehrmacht. And the Panther tank is a special tank because it's by many it's considered the best tank of the war. About 6,000 were built, and there were three versions: the Panther D, the Panther A, and the Panther G. And the G is supposed to have the shot trap on the turret, and actually it doesn't have that one. It doesn't have the shot trap chin, because on the turret there should be the shot trap was because enemy tanks could shoot on the rounded turret front here and then deflect shells into the frontal upper plate of the tank. And because the Germans found out about it, they were making front plates with so-called chins, and they were extended almost onto the frontal plate, but that's not the case here. So while this is supposed to be a Panther G, because the Panther A was not very common in the last years of the war, the Panther G was the most common one in the Battle of the Bulge, and they were fighting against Allied tank destroyers like the M10, and they were very successful in taking out Shermans. But the G, which was fighting mostly in France, is portrayed incorrectly in game, as you can see from the missing chin. It is also not having any skirts, which were also present on the G version, I guess. Although there were also G versions without skirts, so that could be okay. It can also be upgraded with MG42, and like I told before, the sloped armor was a design steal from the Soviets that were making the T-34 that way. So this brings us to the next tank, and I have three big tanks left. And let's start with the weirdest one.
Sturmtiger ready.
This is the Sturmtiger. And the Sturmtiger is the weirdest one because it is a very weird vehicle. It's actually a Tiger 1 chassis with a large mortar on it. Therefore it's officially called the Sturm Wagon, which you can see here. Mörser means mortar. And this is such a large caliber gun that the loading had to be done by a crane, which you can see here. The rockets and the shells that were fired by a rocket mechanism, they were loaded onto the vehicle with this crane. The Sturmtiger was super rare because before we have seen vehicles that were built like about 100 or 50 or 40 or 20 even, but this one takes the cake because this only reached the number of 18 in total, and it was made by Alcat between the end of 1943 and January 1945. This was a very large vehicle. It was weighing 68 tons, but we will see that there are two more vehicles that were even heavier. The rockets that were launched, as you can see in the description, they were 38 centimeters RW61, and they had there was also an MG34, which you can see here. It's the hull gun, the coaxial machine gun, and it looks actually like it is an MG34, so that's realistically done. Very good. When they were fighting in close quarters, the Germans, for example in Stalingrad, they used Sturmgeschütz 3 vehicles with that were modified with big artillery pieces on them, and therefore they saw that they wanted to have a large anti-tank. A large anti-infantry and anti-structure vehicle, because the Stuks that were being in use by then, they were being blown up by the anti-tank infantry weaponry that was improved over time during the war. So the Sturmtiger was designed by Krupp, and then they were taken over via Henschel to Alket, and Hitler said, okay, it's a good design, but he waited until it was halfway through to 1944 almost, until he gave his go to for the production. So he said, well, we need a lot of ammo for these Sturmtigers, so there was an emphasis on production of the rockets. It should be a heavy infantry support vehicle, but by the time that the first Sturmtiger was hitting the field, Germany was on the retreat, and they could not use this vehicle offensively really. The most infamous place where these vehicles were fighting was the Warsaw Uprising, where it was used against the Polish resistance and the Armia Krajowa, the home army, which was trying to seize initiative before the Red Army was crossing the Vistula, but the Red Army just halted and waited until the Germans had crushed the uprising. Very tragic episode in Polish history of World War II. The Sturmtiger were also serving in the Ardennes offensive, and there were 7 of them present there, and they were used also against tanks. And one episode about the Sturmtiger tells about in a battle in Germany itself, close to the bridge at Remagen. The Sturmtigers, one of those Sturmtigers that was present there, allegedly hit a group of stationary Shermans in a village, and all those Shermans were being put out of action, the crews killed and or wounded. They were killed or wounded, of course. It's a bit useless to be wounded after you died. So this is the only tank-on-tank combat that a Sturmtiger is ever recorded engaging in. So in game it's also used as an anti-infantry weapon mostly. Let's see what it looks like if it fires the shell. It's a large explosion, and the sound you hear is supposed to represent the tinnitus of everyone standing around. So after this you have to reload it, and you can see that there's a guy coming out of the hull. They are putting the crane in to service. They are lifting a rocket, and it's going to be put in the chamber of the gun, and then the crew disappears into the vehicle again. And now they will take the last steps in order to make the vehicle ready, and then it can fire again. Pretty funny that they made this animation, because it's actually realistic that the crew had to get out in order to operate the crane. Okay, let's move on to the next vehicle, which is the Yak Tiger. This is actually the heaviest vehicle in the German army ever. The Yak Tiger was actually, it means hunting tiger, and it was a tank destroyer, and it was based on the chassis of the Tiger II. The Yak Tiger was actually called the Panzerjäger Tiger Ausführung B, and it weighed 71 tons, so it was the heaviest vehicle in not only the German army but also in all Allied armies together. Because it was so heavy, it was difficult to operate, and it was very slow. The gun was very powerful. It was a 128mm Pak 44, and it could one-shot every tank which was present on the Western Front. It was both on the Western and the Eastern Front, but it was also pretty rare. Only between 70 and 90 of these vehicles were made by the Nibelungenwerk in Germany. The tank destroyer was a successful vehicle in the German army, as I've been talking about the Stuck and the Yak Panzer before, but the problem of those vehicles was that they could not kill the biggest new tanks of the Allies, especially not the IS-2 and the ISU-152 of the Soviets. So the Yak Tiger was produced to solve this problem. It had a large armament. It had the front was 250mm thick, but because it was so heavy, it had a lot of mechanical and technical problems, because the engine actually wasn't really powerful enough to move this beast of a vehicle. So therefore, in Company of Heroes, you have this engine improvement thing, and there you can see that it will move a bit better, but still really slow. It has a special ammo in Company of Heroes, APCBC, which is a larger high explosive shell than usually, and it can also do some kind of a barrage, which is not really realistic, because this was a tank hunter and it was used to hunt tanks. Well, I already said that there were only 70 to 90 made, and that's about half of that they actually wanted to build, but lack of material prevented the Germans from making more of these. There was this famous guy, Otto Carius, and he commanded one of the 3 companies of Yak Tigers, and he stated in his book Tigers in the Mud that they were not utilized to their full potential, and Allied air supremacy made it difficult to maneuver around. The massive heavy gun needed to be recalibrated from jarring after traveling a bit. Even for a short distance they had to recalibrate. Also the crews were not very experienced, and because they had to do so many stuff, they were also scared sometimes. And there were various engagements in which the Yak Tiger could easily destroy columns of enemy armor, but when the crew was seeing the large numbers of enemy tanks, they decided to turn the vehicle around and drive away, therefore showing their weak side armor and rear armor, enabling the Allied tanks to penetrate the side and the rear. So this meant that the Yak Tiger could have been way more successful if it wasn't for the lack of experience of the crews. So this brings us to our last land vehicle in this video. This is the King Tiger. It's actually officially called the Panzer Kampfwagen Tiger Ausführung B, or the Tiger II. And this is the German nickname for it was the Königstiger, which means Bengal tiger. And so the word King Tiger is wrong because it's not a real animal, whereas the Bengal tiger is. So this one was the successor of the Tiger I, of course. It was only in service from the invasion of Normandy. So whereabouts, the first engagement that it was taking part in was in Operation Goodwood against the British in 1944. And it also saw a lot of action in the Battle of the Bulge. Almost 500 of these were built. It was also very heavy, 68.5 tons, but as you might have noticed, that's lighter than the Yak Tiger. And it was a thick armor, heavy tank, and it was not turretless, as opposed to the Yak Tiger. So the King Tiger was attached to the Panzer Lehr Division, which was in Normandy. They were fighting in Operation Cobra, for example. And the first Tiger IIs proved very unreliable. They were having breakdowns, leaking seals and gaskets, and so they had to improve on it. When the Tiger IIs were being put in use on the Eastern Front, they broke down before they could be used in combat. And when they were broken down, they were demolished to prevent the Soviets to capture them. In their first fight on the Eastern Front, in the Battle of OKW, they were actually taken out by T-34-85s, which was a medium tank as opposed to this heavy beast. So that was not very good propaganda for the Germans, and they needed to do some better performances. So they were using it in significant numbers in the Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. They were put into 4 heavy panzer battalions, and about 150 of these were present, which is almost 35% of the total production of the Tiger II. A famous engagement is one between a Tiger II and an M8 Greyhound in St. Vith, and the Greyhound actually succeeded to disable the Tiger II, shooting 3 37mm rounds into the rear armor of the King Tiger, setting it on fire, which is actually quite surprising because this behemoth you would expect to kill off every moving vehicle in the vicinity. But the Tiger II was actually a bit too late on the battlefield. It also had the sloped armor thingy, which the Panthers had, and it had some applique armor here, tracks for extra protection against Panzerfaust-like weapons, like the Piat from the British and the bazooka from the Americans. So this made the crew feel pretty safe. And if you want to see a King Tiger for yourself, you could visit La Glaise in Belgium, because there's still one in public space, visible for everyone. After the war, they tried to tow it away to scrap it, but a woman from the village at La Glaise told the guys that she wanted to buy it from them for a super small amount of money, and then they agreed, and so she could have the tank and therefore it's still there for everyone to see. Okay, so let's move on to the planes.
Orders confirmed.
The planes in the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht are Stukas, like the ones in the Wehrmacht, and as you can see here, they are actually the exact same models. So they are the Kanonenvogel Stukas with the cannons on the side, and that's pretty unrealistic. There's two problems with the realism here. At first, the Luftwaffe in the end of the war almost didn't have any Stukas left. Second, the Stukas that were present were not these Kanonenvogel type Stukas that you can see flying around here. So, although this ability is useful for the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht player, it's a pretty unrealistic one when it comes to the presence of Stukas on the Western Front in 1944-1945. So, with the Stukas flying into the sunset, this concludes our video about the vehicles of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. As you can see, it has the rarest German vehicles of the Second World War. And well, I hope you enjoyed it. And that's it for this video. Thanks for watching and have a nice day.